All right, and I told you we were going to do something kind of cool because this is an interesting story here, and I think it's just a lot of fun to kind of talk about. So there has been a space station just floating around. Is that correct? Like it's just been floating around for a couple years now.
Exactly. So China's very first space station, the Tiangong 1, was launched in 2011.
Okay.
And there were a couple of unmanned missions where astronauts were not aboard this space station, and there were some manned missions as well where astronauts visited Chinese astronauts. Fewer than a dozen Chinese astronauts
Right,
have actually
not a ton,
made it
but
into
definitely,
space,
yeah.
which is really amazing because here, the U.S. and the Russians, you know, we've been going at this space race for more than a half century.
Right.
And so China was really late to the game with their space program.
Right.
Only after 2000, I believe, was the first launch of a
Which
manned
you
flight
think about
for
it,
China.
that's not very long ago. I mean, it really isn't, time-wise. It's less than 20 years.
Right. So for them to really get into manned space flight and to progress this quickly is impressive. You remember a few years ago they had the Jade Rabbit. That was the translation of the lunar rover. It was unmanned, but the fact that they've now sent a probe to the moon, the fact that they've had astronauts not only reach low Earth orbit, but have had multiple space stations now, it is impressive in itself. And so a lot of folks who follow space flight very closely are speculating that China is our next big competitor when it comes to, are they going to go to the moon and send astronauts to the moon? Are they going to try and beat us to Mars and send the first humans to the red planet? So really kind of impressive to see how far they've come in such a short period of time, but they also have the capital to make this happen, because if you think about it, you know, the economy, the planned economy, they can divert as much or as little resources to their space program, I suppose, as they'd like.
Yeah.
You know, and with the population that they have, they've got the pick of the litter, so to speak, for the very best, the very brightest to work on not only sending satellites, but probes into space. And in this case, what we're talking about today is the Tiangong 1 space station, which has been technically out of control since 2016.
I think that's the intriguing part, is that it's just been floating around. Like, that's it.
And so once the spacecraft is put into a low Earth orbit, it's continuing to circle the Earth, so to speak, and any type of space station. The Russians have had space stations in orbit for decades.
Yeah.
The Salyut space stations, the Mir space station, remember, it was launched in the 80s, and then it was deorbited. Our very first space station was the Skylab space station, and it was lifted into orbit in the late 70s as the moon program was coming, the Apollo moon landing program was coming to a close. They used parts from that to put actually a very sizable space station in orbit, and it almost wasn't successful because of a solar array failed to properly deploy, and there were problems with temperature on board the Skylab space station, and eventually we kind of got that under control, and that was America's first foray into having some sort of orbiting outpost, a laboratory, a place for the astronauts to stay, to do experiments on the human body. And then our joint venture with all of these nations, except China, and you know, many speculate that that's because of their human rights abuses. They were not invited to take part in the International Space Station, which the planning stages for that got underway in the 80s. The construction started in the late 90s, and then it was completed just a few years ago. Anyway, I say all of that to give you some background on exactly what we're dealing with here. But this is China's first space station, and its orbit is now decaying. Normally, there is some type of thruster or booster that helps to speed up and raise the altitude of the space station. So, for example, the International Space Station, which we're all very familiar with, you know, every so often it will fire thrusters on board that will literally raise the altitude.
Keep it up there.
Because as it continues to orbit the Earth, you know, it's not completely without gravity. The pull of the Earth is slowly
still
pulling
bringing
it
it in,
down.
right.
And so without those reboosts, it will eventually come down. And that's what we're seeing right now. This is an uncontrolled re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere.
And so it's just coming down.
Exactly.
We just don't know when. It says on or about April 1st.
And so we'll know as we get closer and closer to the anticipated re-entry of this exactly when and where we can expect it to come down. But because this space station, and again, I want to make sure to emphasize, this is the Chinese Tiangong space station. This is not the international space station that we're familiar with. And the other thing I should point out too is that the Tiangong space station is unmanned at this point. It hasn't been visited in many years.
In a while, yeah.
You remember the Gravity movie with George Clooney
Yes.
and Sandra Bullock? She mentioned Tiangong in that movie. And so this morning we actually got some really cool video, and I believe you're pulling it up here in just a moment. Some new radar imagery from a high-powered radar facility in Germany that actually is getting the latest kind of scan of what Tiangong looks like right now in orbit.
Okay.
And we're expecting sometime in the next couple of days, between now and Monday, which is April 2nd, that it will come back into the atmosphere. The heat from the friction on the surface of the spacecraft and its speed, the velocity will just cause it to break apart. And most of the space station, most of Tiangong will break apart, will disintegrate.
Basically just disintegrate. Mm-hmm.
But as we've seen with other large spacecraft, large pieces may survive re-entry, and that's what there's a slight worry right now about, is where could it be, where could it come down, and it would...
It's all just literally up in the air right now.
It is up in the air.
It is up in the air. We have no idea.
And so, there's a slight worry that it could come down in a highly populated area.
Sure.
But the people who know, the scientists who are calculating the trajectory of this, are saying it would be like winning the lottery 100 times. Or 1,000,000 times.
Oh, okay.
So the chances are super slim. You'd have to be, in this case, a very unlucky person in order for that to happen.
So we've got a couple of things here. First, talk to me about this image here. Now, you were telling me...
This is so cool. We are looking live right now at the view from the International Space Station.
So this is the International Space Station,
so
and then you can see Earth.
Yeah, the center of the screen there, you've got the curvature of the Earth, and this is looking out from the International Space Station. On the right side of your screen is the Russian Soyuz spacecraft and its solar arrays there. Not clear which docking port this is, whether it's the Poisk or the Pirs docking port.
Oh, gotcha, okay.
There are two Russian Soyuz spacecraft docked at the space station at all times. One can be used as a lifeboat to get the crew back to Earth safely in the event of an emergency. But just to give you some perspective, and how often do we get to do this? This is what is happening right now, 250 miles above us.
So this video here, now this doesn't have any audio. It's not a package or anything, is it?
Correct. This is just some video that we want to give you an idea of what the Tiangong spacecraft, the space station, looks like. These are new radar images just in this morning from this high-powered radar in Germany, and you can see the solar arrays on Tiangong extending on either side of the spacecraft. And this is on the right side of your screen now, a computer animation that's showing you what it really looks like versus the left side of the screen. So if we see it breaking apart in the sky, this is actually what it could look like as it's disintegrating.
That's beautiful.
So this is the European Space Agency's ATV. It's a cargo spacecraft, and it was used to bring supplies and cargo to the International Space Station for several years. And this is the Jules Verne spacecraft coming back into Earth's atmosphere and breaking apart in February of 2015. So this could give you an idea what a very large spacecraft will look like as it re-enters the atmosphere and breaks apart, and you can see those small explosions,
tiny little explosions, and the very
front.
Look at the glow on the very, very front part there. That is unbelievable.
Really impressive, because it's just coming in at such a high velocity, and just the chunks are coming off, and of course,
so we could see something similar to this.
And potentially on a larger scale, because the Tiangong weighs 19,000 pounds.
Whoa.
And it is headed towards Earth. We're seeing it trending towards sometime around Sunday, April the 1st. And there are agencies all around the world that are closely monitoring
watching
this.
it, yeah.
From the European Space Agency, which has an entire unit that's dedicated to tracking space debris, whether it's orbiting the Earth
right.
or whether it's coming back into the atmosphere, and they will be tracking this closely. Of course, the Chinese Space Agency is also following this very closely. The interesting thing, too, and we're back to those images here. I don't know if you're able to loop this, but you can restart it once it finishes here.
Yeah.
Tiangong, translated from Mandarin, means heavenly palace.
Heavenly palace. I think I read that somewhere this morning. Heavenly palace.
And the later iterations of the Tiangong space station. So, there have been other Tiangong space stations that have been put into orbit.
Right.
Have housed several astronauts. They did science experiments. Did experiments and research on the human body. They taught lessons to school children in China. But again, the main thing here, as we're watching this and waiting and seeing exactly where it could go, the probability of this is very, very low. But there is a stretch of the north central part of the United States between California and New York that potentially could be in the path of debris.
Which is funny, because we did a story earlier this week, and it was about a couple that had busted out all their telescopes on their back patio. Like, they are gearing up for it. They're really excited and just fingers crossing that they were actually going to be able to see something. And it was a cute story.
And you remember back in the late 70s when Space Lab was deorbited, and it actually broke apart on reentry. Normally, when they bring in space stations like Mir, when it was deorbited, spacecraft like what we were just seeing with the European Space Agency's ATV spacecraft, as it was being brought in, they're usually able to do a controlled deorbit. And normally they aim for a specific stretch of the South Pacific that's very remote, and it's going to be a low impact to human life, to the environment, to any kind of ecosystems. That's not the case here, again, because
it's
this is out
falling.
of control.
Yeah, like it is actually free falling towards Earth.
And what's really interesting here is that in the rare occurrence that there are larger pieces that would reach the ground, especially in a populated area, different space agencies are warning people against touching this debris because apparently it may contain it's a highly toxic and corrosive substance. It's called hydrazine, and that could also survive reentry. So this is the same substance, if you remember, here in East Texas back in 2003 when the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart. They were telling people here in East Texas not to touch any of the shuttle debris because it may also have some of this corrosive, this toxic chemical substance on it called hydrazine. And so this is a common chemical, a common substance used in aerospace. And so it's just fascinating to see that this could be the show in the sky.
If we were able to see that, it would really, really be incredible.
Again, I know some of you may have just tuned in. I just want to remind you that as we're talking about the Tiangong space station making its re-entry over the next couple of days, it is unmanned. There are no astronauts aboard. And
haven't been for quite some time. It's just been floating around.
Absolutely. So as of mid-January, the spacecraft was about 280 kilometers in altitude, and that was when they really started to notice that its orbit was decaying. It was getting lower and lower, so to speak, or closer to Earth. And because they've not been in control of this spacecraft for a couple of years now, there were no opportunity for the ground controllers to command the engines to fire up, to speed it up so that it gains some more altitude.
Wow. I mean, and just looking at these images, so we're going to be able to know as they're tracking it, and I say any of the authorities, and everyone who's tracking it, we'll be able to know kind of where up in the sky as it gets closer. Do you think that we'll know where possibly, and you know what I mean, like get to where we're pinpointing where it's going to be entering? And
so as ground controllers, as scientists, as mathematicians, statisticians here on the ground are able to get a better grasp of exactly what its altitude, its speed, its velocity is and where it will actually
where we
begin
need to be looking up.
re-entering the atmosphere. Once we get
Wow.
closer to that point of no return, so to speak, we will have a much better idea. They can calculate the trajectory and determine with very impressive accuracy
Right.
where this will come down. But the big question is what parts of this, if any, will survive re-entry? You know, which parts just are going to be too sturdy, so to speak, or won't burn up in the atmosphere.
Right. How much of it is going to survive coming through the atmosphere?
So it's about 10 meters long. Its main body is made up of 2 cylinders. They're equal in length. There's a service module and an experiment module. And so that experiment module was kind of the habitation area where the astronauts would do their experiments. That was where they would control the spacecraft. And then the service module is where everything from water to chemicals, you know, consumables like oxygen, nitrogen, CO2, all of that.
Is there a picture of it on here? Let me see if we can.
You should be able to, to Google it.
Spell it for me. It's TIANGONG. There we go.
1. That's it.
All right, let's go over to our images. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Is that it?
That's it. That's basically what it looks like. And that latest radar scan that we got from Germany this morning shows that it's intact because, again, it's just imagine it being kind of powered down or at a very low power state. So it's not that it's been destroyed or disabled, something of the sort. It just has been out of control, out of contact with the ground controllers there in China. So again, when we're talking about where will it go and when will we know where it's going, the European Space Agency is saying that it will be 1 day before the actual re-entry. But the impact prediction, the location of that is still kind of up in the air at this point. It's beyond the current technical capabilities due to the atmosphere, the dynamics of it re-entering, all of that. So
this is
we'll have an idea, but
yeah, it's pretty awesome. I mean, it's just so, you know, when we talk about it, it's so funny because we're just like, yeah, it's just kind of free falling, and you know, it's the way that it works, you know, like whenever they put the Tesla up, that to me was just the most bizarre. I couldn't stop staring at it. It was the most beautiful view I'd ever seen.
It was so beautiful it almost looked fake, and I hesitate to use that word because I don't even want to plant a seed in someone's head because it was real.
Well, and it's still in my head now that now the car is just floating around there somewhere.
Right.
So is this going to do the same thing 3, 4, or 5 years from now? Like, is the car ever going to have to come back?
Depending on what its trajectory was when it was, you know, if it broke low Earth orbit, and I believe they were putting it on a trajectory to head into deep space toward Mars.
Yes.
So if everything goes according to plan, Earth's gravity shouldn't recapture it.
Shouldn't bring it back. Yeah,
in.
I just think it's bizarre that some of the stuff that we don't know about on an everyday basis has just been, this has been floating around since 2016 unmanned. Like, there's no one in it.
You know, and there were, back to when we were talking about Space Lab, the American space station that broke apart and was deorbited. It actually, there were large chunks of it that were found in the Australian outback.
Oh, wow.
And you can still find, to this day, small pieces available for purchase on eBay. So you can count on people keeping a close eye on exactly where
They're going to be watching.
But again, you really have to be thinking about your safety because we're talking about some very hazardous chemicals, some substances that could survive re-entry here.
Exactly.
And that's a concern. But there are going to be those people out there hunting for this. There were actually, like, squares, like almost like a bingo, you know, that there were stretches of latitude and longitude that people were buying back at the time that Skylab was being deorbited. It was almost like a game rather. But again, the chances of somebody being hit by a piece of debris from Tiangong, according to the European Space Agency, is something like 10 million times smaller than the yearly chance of being hit by lightning.
Oh my.
10 million times smaller than your chance of being struck by lightning. So really, really small. And in the history of space flight, no casualties due to falling space debris have ever been confirmed.
I wonder how much space debris comes in that we maybe aren't 100% aware about. You know what I'm saying?
Sure, and what's really interesting is that not only the American government through NASA, but the European Space Agency, the Russian Space Agency, are actively tracking space debris that's orbiting the Earth.
Wild.
So not just the stuff that's coming in, but they're tracking even very small pieces of debris. But it really is fascinating, this field of space junk. If you think about it, over the last 50 or 60 years that space flight has been in action, in progress, rocket bodies, paint flecks, dead satellites.
Yeah.
Oh, you found something here.
Oh, I'm looking.
It's really scary. If you want to show that, that's.
Is this? Oh, look.
So those are
let's
not
take a look
only active satellites, but what's called a dead satellite. And some of these are in orbit still. Some of them are being decayed. And there's an actual theory, and just because I was going to talk about it, it's left my mind, but there's an actual theory that's being tested, which basically scientists are worried about space debris crashing into other space debris or satellites or the space station, and almost causing like a chain reaction of one thing slamming into another and breaking into fragments, hitting other objects in space and breaking into, I believe it's called the Kessler theory. See if you can Google that for me.
With a C or K? K. It's
C. I'm sorry, K.
Let's see what all we can find here.
Yes, Kessler syndrome, the Kessler effect. Yeah, cascading ablation.
Oh, okay.
So again, if you're looking at your screen right now, this is actually video of the European Space Agency's Jules Verne cargo craft as it was being intentionally deorbited in 2015. And this is going to give you an idea of what it will look like as the Chinese Tiangong spacecraft, the space station, will deorbit and burn up in the atmosphere over the next couple of days. And so there's a documentary really looking at this Kessler syndrome.
All right, let's check this out.
You can see this animation here where they're tracking. This is an Iridium, I believe it's a Russian satellite. And the idea is that the orbits of these could intersect at some point.
Oh, wow.
And cause large debris fields then to just begin cascading over time. And other orbits then could intersect with this debris field, and it just is a cascading situation. Really fascinating here.
It really is. This is interesting. Wow, and so then it just
will continue. Yeah.
Huh. So sometimes we see these.
And it really is something that space agencies for several different countries are concerned about, because as we continue to rely on technology, satellite technology, and our need and desire to send humans into space, there's more and more stuff up there that we have to track and we have to worry about, because anything larger than maybe a grain of sand, a paint chip, a paint fleck can cause extreme damage to spacecraft, to a satellite, to a manned spacecraft.
Sure.
So I remember always seeing with the space shuttle as it was coming back to Earth and being reprocessed for its next mission, they were having to look at divots in the glass on the windshield or different windows, because part of the paint from a rocket on separation may have hit it. And you have to think, though, at how fast you're going.
Wow.
Thousands of miles per hour at this point, and something that small hitting another object at that speed.
That is just
absolutely
wild.
Incredible.
I'm pretty excited to see this thing come in. I mean, this is going to be, if we get to see a view like the video is going to show here in just a second, that is going to be amazing. And so it hasn't been manned. It's been basically, I guess, free falling for what? Since 2016?
Since 2016, right. It's been unoccupied since 2013, and the spacecraft, like I said, is about 12 meters long, and it was more than 8,500 kilograms at launch, and so this is huge. This is a very big spacecraft.
Well, and look at the one image that we found here. It's actually compared next to a school bus. So check that one out.
Yeah, that's very impressive, and all of us are familiar with a school bus.
Yeah.
In one form or fashion. But the images that we were just seeing of the model and then the radar images were actually monitored and tracked by the Fraunhofer FHR Research Institute near Wachtberg. That's near Bonn in the western part of Germany.
Gotcha.
And the spacecraft at that point was only about 270 kilometers in altitude. So the data images, the radar, all of that is being pooled, and here it is. On the left side is the actual radar image, and on the right side is the animation really showing you the latest images of what this looks like as it begins to re-enter the atmosphere over the next couple of days. So most of the craft, again, should burn up. It finished its mission, its operational life, and then there was the plan to controlled deorbit this space station, and that
it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, there were some problems in 2013, and there's been zero contact with it. They've had no control over it for at least the last year and a half or more. So
wow. So we're just definitely going to have to keep an eye out on this thing. And how do you pronounce it again? Because I think I said it wrong earlier.
Tiangong.
Tiangong.
Heavenly Palace is the translation in English, which is really interesting.
Heavenly Palace.
And so, again, as we were talking about that Kessler effect, the theory that's, about this cascading debris that's just kind of picking up in steam, so to speak, there are actually efforts underway not only within NASA, private companies as well, where they're trying to figure out what they can do to eliminate the problem of,
like the simplistic child in me thinks 2 rockets with a big fishing net, like a big net and starting to net it in.
Essentially, that is one of the big theories.
Like a big control area.
Is to use a big net to kind of just sail through space and collect it.
Yeah.
And a small spacecraft that can maneuver. There's also one idea of using a laser to essentially zap different, satellites and space debris as well. But it is a big problem. We've got to be thinking about this.
There was that much. We're going to pull it up again. It was the Kessler. Yeah, that's what it was. I didn't realize there was that. What was it? Kessler what?
The Kessler theory or Kessler syndrome.
I mean, this is...
And you kind of saw this in that movie Gravity a few years ago, where you remember there were some problems where I remember at that point it was like a space station and maybe the Hubble crashed into each other, and then there was just debris. And so that kind of was where a lot of people got their first introduction into the Kessler syndrome.
I just want to show everybody this real quick because this is pretty fun. And I can play this video for us.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, let's listen to it.
All right, do you have headphones? We're going to watch this. We're going to learn something pretty interesting today. All right, let's go back. All right, here we go.
Kessler is really a pioneer in the space debris world. He was one of the first people to recognize the fact that things that we put into space last a long time, that eventually we're going to have a problem if we don't manage that population better.
I'm Don Kessler. I'm the former senior scientist for orbital debris research at NASA. Space is a natural resource like no other. The area we use has become polluted with objects by the debris generated when they collide. What's alarming is that the problem will get worse, even if we stop adding stuff. This happens as a result of collisional cascading. Objects collide at very high velocities, creating a large number of fragments that go on to collide with other objects, creating even more fragments, which then collide with more objects and on and on. This phenomena is sometimes referred to as the Kessler syndrome.
Don is often referred to as the father of orbital debris. in a positive way, not the negative way. But he's responsible for better understanding the debris, what it means to space operations.
At the beginning of the space program, there was a general attitude that space was a big sky, that you could put anything in it that you wanted and not fill it up. The problem that you quickly run into is because these things are traveling so fast, they run into each other. And as soon as they run into each other, they create a lot of debris.
And the rate of collisions will then increase. And as the collisions increase, you make more debris.
And those fragments go collide with other things, and you start really making it more difficult and more expensive to operate in space.
After convincing NASA that this was an issue, we launched a program of investigating the problems of space junk, with the primary goal of researching and developing solutions to keep space a reusable resource. One of my first jobs was to define the natural space environment. And what gave me an advantage over other people in looking at the orbital debris environment is I used those same models that we used to understand the natural environment and applied them for the first time to the satellite environment. Part of what I did was borrow some from kinetic energy equations and thermodynamic equations of molecules in a box bouncing around. And even though we've got much more sophisticated models today, they all come up with the same answer. The orbital debris problem is a classic tragedy of the commons problem, but on a global scale. If we don't change the way we operate in space, all this results in an exponentially increasing amount of debris until all objects are reduced to a cloud of orbiting fragments that are capable of destroying any spacecraft that attempts to operate anywhere within that cloud.
Okay, super fascinating.
So that's just really one fascinating look at something that's
Space junk.
conversation. Yeah, space junk,
Space
a big
junk.
problem. Now
Oh my
that's not
gosh.
necessarily in play right now. So if you're just
Right.
joining us, what we're talking about is the Tiangong 1 spacecraft. It's a space station, the Chinese space station, their very first venture into this type of manned space flight. It's been out of contact, it's been out of control since at least 2016. It hasn't had a crew aboard since 2013. So that's one important thing to point out here. This is unmanned.
It's unmanned. It is empty, and it hasn't even been in contact for a couple years.
Right.
It's just out there on its own.
So over the next couple of days, by Monday at the latest, it's looking like this is going to make an uncontrolled re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere and break apart. We don't know at this point exactly where, but we do know there's a high likelihood that there could be some debris visible or even reach the ground here in North America. There's a swath of land between, let's see, California and New York and the upper portions of the U.S.
Right.
that could actually see this. And it's not among the largest uncontrolled re-entries that we've seen. Skylab, the American space station from the late 70s, was the largest, and it actually, a large portion of it survived re-entry and hit the ground in Australia. There's now
That's so
pieces
wild.
of it in museums around the world, including the Cosmodrome in Kansas. You can actually see parts of the Skylab there as well. But again, the important thing here, there's going to be a lot of people looking to get their hands on a piece of debris
Yes.
if it survives re-entry, but the experts are saying don't do that. It could have very hazardous chemicals, a substance called hydrazine, which is used in the aerospace industry.
Right. No touching.
Don't touch it. That could survive re-entry. So the space station was launched in 2011 by China. There were manned crews, there were unmanned missions, really to just test out. This was their first venture into having a space station. There have been other Tiangongs that have built upon what they learned the first go-round.
And I wonder how much money, so we talk about the space junk and everything that's sitting up there. So this is just one example. All the money that's up there, that's floating around between satellites, oh, happy birthday, and I just, it's dollar signs to me too, and I'm like, wow, the investments, and then it's just gonna burn up as it comes back.
Just going to burn up here
That's
over
it.
the next
Like-
couple of days, and we really won't know until about 24 hours out. But rest assured, NASA, the European Space Agency, the Chinese Space Agency, the Russian Space Agency,
Right.
all of these are tracking Tiangong's every move, and we'll have a much better idea of where this is coming in over the next couple of days. So
It's gonna be
it's gonna
exciting.
an
We're definitely-
impressive,
yeah.
show in the sky, especially if we get to see it if it's at night.
Oh, if it's at night, that's going to be amazing. Yeah, because that would be really, I mean, it's so beautiful, but it's kind of scary looking too. to see something
Right,
like
it's about the size of a bus.
Yeah, coming through
8.5
the atmosphere.
metric tons. 8.5 metric tons when it was first launched. Now, of course, that statistic includes some of its consumables, oxygen, fuel,
Right.
water, things like that. So it is a bit less as far as its mass
A
is
little bit
concerned,
lighter,
its initial
but
mass.
yeah.
But yeah. So just an exciting and interesting moment in space
I'm very,
history.
very excited. So, all right, we're going to keep an eye on this throughout the weekend. It's going to be a lot of fun. I mean, it'd be perfect if it was on GMAT Monday morning and the whole crew could run outside and go live.
Where is it?